Hello, everybody, and welcome to our World Today, the Unionist Perspective. Today, we're going to be looking at a few topics that we believe align to unpacking what tends to be repeating cycles where learning needs to take place because of the repetition, whereas there's also the opportunity to choose to learn as things are happening so that cycles don't repeat themselves. So we are looking at the essence of learning and how that presents itself through the news items that we've identified as showing up those themes. And in essence, one of the things that we believe is probably at the core of it is that as you learn, it brings in a greater cycle of stability because you're building a more solid foundation, where the repetition of cycles tends to highlight a more sense of instability because there's no learning and implementing the lesson. So the lesson repeats itself, which in and of itself fuels the instability. So I'm going to open it up to the team to ask them, just in terms of the topics that we've identified, the news items that we've identified, which one stands out most in terms of starting to highlight the theme that we've identified for today's discussion.
For me, I feel like the Sudan story is probably the main one that stands out in terms of repeating certain cycles or just certain patterns. Especially with the old leader, Omar al-Bashir, being ousted. It's interesting that the way that he came to power involved, violence, an overthrow, a coup. There was a lot of like one group pitted kind of against the other. And I believe he came into power in the early 80s, if I'm not mistaken, like 1983. I did some background research, and only until recently, I think 2019 or something, that's when he was basically ousted and kind of left the leadership of the country up in the air. And now we're seeing that, or at least I feel like there's a similar pattern happening where there really isn't any like real dialogue in terms of what the country desires moving forward in its leadership. But once again, it's a sort of like military style, warfare or just like upheaval happening. And so, as I was reading that, I found it interesting because Yureen asked the question in the group in Discord of like whether or not this is a byproduct of learning or it's like some sort of pattern repeating. And on the outside, it looks like a pattern repeating, but I don't know if it's like a pathway to deeper learning for that country. And so I'm interested to kind of see how you all feel about what is happening right now in Sudan.
I think the thing that stood out to me the most about it from things that I was listening to about it, is that apparently the attitude of a lot of people in Sudan who aren't involved with the conflict is that this is like the military's conflict. Like this is conflict between two factions of people, and it's their dispute and they're trying to grab at power, and it has nothing to do with us. So I'm not going to take sides and I'm not going to get involved. and I feel like I don't remember exactly if this was mentioned, but I think it was mentioned that in the past that wasn't as much the case, like with the previous strife in the country. And I know that there has been like a lot of just various wars between and guerrilla fighting between like different factions in like other countries like Ethiopia, neighboring, and yeah, various other ones in the region. And so I thought that was notable because I was like, well, that sounds like a healthier view on the conflict for the people to just say like it's not my conflict. Like these are just two power hungry groups. The thing about it though is that those two groups are like destroying and like causing tons of like collateral damage, right, in Khartoum. So it's not like you can just say like, oh, I have no like I'm just gonna pretend that this doesn't exist, which of course nobody can pretend that it doesn't exist, but I'm just like, I don't know what they would do beyond having that posture toward it, but at least apparently there's not widespread like people taking sides in it, because I feel like that would only add fuel to it, but this approach doesn't. I don't know, what do you guys feel about that?
So something that probably would stand out for me in the process of learning is that there comes a point at which you do need to pick a position. And it might not necessarily devolve into choosing sides, but you do need to pick a position. And that will probably influence the national consciousness at a level. And so if there's a sense that people are not picking sides, it might be the reason why Sudan has these cyclical, violent uprisings and basically infighting. So it's literally a power struggle, because in not choosing a side, you in essence give away your power, which is probably the thing that's fueling the continuous conflict. And we can liken it ourselves as a human being. When we are confused about which road to take, it takes a mental and physical toll on your psyche. And so you can almost see the physical and mental toll and even the spiritual toll on the psyche of the Sudanese people, that even during the holy month of Ramadan and the celebration of Eid, that they cannot actually honor their religion. So it does require a choice. It requires a definite choice, because the lesson is clearly not being learned. The lesson being that your choice is powerful, and if you choose not to exercise your power in making a choice, that creates almost a consciousness of confusion at the national level.
Yeah, I totally agree. I feel like it is a repeating pattern, and the pattern is repeating so that a definite choice can be made, just like you were pointing out there. That's what it feels like.
Yeah, I agree. Because historically Sudan is a country that has experienced a lot of conflict, even to the point where they split up, right? Because now there's like South Sudan. And so I feel like just that happening is like externally is a sign of like the disconnect, or like the sort of like what we're getting at, like this apathy of like not choosing, not taking sides. But that doesn't really help you in the long run. It just causes more separation, and it's externally manifested for that country, where they literally split because there's these two sides, or however many sides, that just can't agree with one another. And I also thought it was very ironic that all this was happening during Ramadan. I felt like it was a sign that there's something there for the people, that they're not, it's almost like they're not respecting themselves. Because if you really truly respect yourself and love yourself, you're going to make a decision that's going to align with that love and respect, and kind of taking the stance of, oh, well, we're not going to take sides, this is not our conflict. I feel like it's kind of like almost like a cop out, and it just allows the people that have been in power, the military, to keep doing what they've been doing. It's like this feeling of like disempowerment.
I agree. I think though part of the reason is that the two sides, like the military and the paramilitary forces that are in conflict, the average people of Sudan, or maybe at least in Khartoum, they don't favor either side because they're both corrupt. They're both basically living by the sword and using brute force to try to secure their own very shallow interests. The high level military leaders in the country, also they're tied up in big economic interests of the country. So that's all it's about. I feel like this is one of the most shallow conflicts around, although most are shallow. And people are whatever, I'm not for either one. But so hypothetically, people who would take a side, which would be the healthier thing to do, is to choose what you actually want rather than stand by while other people decide what happens, would be a third option of standing for some sort of democratic or non-military government, right? That's my thought about it, because I feel like a lot of people wouldn't choose either side. And so that was my perception of it. And I get why they might say that, but then what the reaction that would be most empowering would be no, we want something else. We don't want either of these corrupt groups, I guess that's what I feel about it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think that apathy that we're almost witnessing is an invitation for them to choose to literally at an individual level raise their vibration into finding their power, finding their sense of unity as a country. So if the majority are feeling well, we don't stand, we wouldn't back either of these sides, then it's the choice to back the leaders that will unify the country. And if they don't exist, call them in. That's the kind of thing. And it comes again back to the power of your choice. And it's something that was probably highlighted in one of the conversations that Jeff and Shaleia shared with us in terms when the Russia-Ukraine conflict started. It's what do you stand for under these circumstances? Are you going to choose to honor your home and protect your home? Are you going to choose to flee? Or are you going to crumble in the corner? And we've seen very much from a Ukraine point of view that they've really stood up to that level of aggression. And so, it literally comes back to, regardless of the fact that there is significant conflict, you still have the power to exercise a choice, and it is important to exercise that choice.
Mm-hmm. I wonder though why why certain countries like Ukraine, for example, there's more of a a willingness to like stand up and, you know, have boundaries. And then in other countries like Sudan, there's just a very widespread feeling of, you know, disempowerment and kind of letting people violate your boundaries. And so I wonder why in Sudan. I don't know if it's because, you know, historically they've had so much conflict and people just feel hopeless, or, you know, I don't know. I'm interested in what you guys like, what kind of drives the energy in certain countries like that.
So that's actually a very interesting question, because then if you take it to an individual level, it could potentially be a consciousness of trauma. They have been in such a heightened state of anxiety and fear that they're actually almost debilitated from making the choice. So it's literally that physiological response of flight or fright. And it seems like fright has taken hold. And so they are almost frozen in place, as opposed to making a choice to get out of there or make a new choice from an almost governmental ideological decision level.
Yeah. Yes. And you know, like just the African continent in general, like it's experienced a lot of colonizing and like outside forces coming in. And I'm not quite sure what the history of Sudan is with just colonialism, but I wonder if that plays a part in it. Because I feel like that even relates to the story that I shared about that cult in Kenya. The starvation, like the 40-day starvation, or I don't know how they worded it, but I guess they were told to fast for 40 days, and a bunch of people ended up dying because, of course, if you don't eat for 40 days, yeah, you're gonna perish. But I was even reading like that has also happened in Mozambique. I think, and then there was another instance in Africa where a similar thing happened. It was one individual. It wasn't so widespread as like a whole group of people, but and I kind of mentioned in the Discord, like I thought it was interesting that it was like, even though externally those two stories look very different, like the energy of it is the same, and the fact that it's in Africa, you know, I wonder if there is a connection between kind of like what has developed historically in Africa and then kind of what we're seeing now. Because if you compare it to Ukraine, yeah, Ukraine used to be part of Russia, but, you know, they were able to separate themselves and establish sovereignty and, like, you know, and be a very like successful, like economically successful for the most part, you know, country. But we haven't necessarily maybe seen the same in all areas in Africa. And so I wonder how much of that history is like playing out here now.
That's
And
a
like,
very
why
good
would you want to starve yourself for 40 days? You know, like, like that's my biggest question.
So part of the challenge with a lot of African nations is there's a significant, almost religious zealotism. So that they very much follow what they would perceive to be religious figures who have a direct connection to God. And so they believe that that person is speaking on behalf of God, because that's how they portray themselves. So literally, it's probably quite open to the charlatans of the world if you have the right type of influential character. And so, yeah, like, you know, just with the history repeating itself. I mean, like, even in South Africa, like we've never really had a cult, but we've definitely had levels of religious zealotism in that way that, you know, at some point there was a person going around advising people to use insect spray to ward off demons and stuff like that. And so people, I mean, like for us, we think it's ridiculous, but they, like, in the smaller rural type environments, religious leaders have power. And so this person just, said to them, well, actually, you can use insect spray to ward off demons. And so people walking around with insect spray and passing out because they're spraying the stuff all over the place all the time, kind of thing. And that's one of the more ridiculous examples. But it's happened that people have been swindled out of their savings and things like that. And it doesn't go to the extent of a cult, but it does go to the extent of almost cult-likely following a person that purports to be God's messenger to the world. And so I feel like that plays a big part in how these stories develop in what are essentially many less developed countries.
I mean, we've seen the same in the States, like Jim Jones. I don't know if you're familiar with him, but he had, some cult, and he took people down to like South America, and it was the same sort of thing. Like there was a day where they're all going to plan their suicide, and so they all go to like heaven together. But
My gosh.
yeah, it was crazy. So I mean, it's we definitely see it in the States as well, and I think it just gets to. I mean, honestly, when I was reading the article about the cult, I felt a lot of compassion, because I could feel how desperate, like, people feel so disconnected from source that they're just willing to do anything to be able to, connect without realizing that they themselves are source, they're part of that. And so I have a lot of compassion, but at the end of the day, it's like there has to be a better alternative. Like, what self-respecting person would want to starve themselves for 40 days so they can like go be with Jesus? Like, it just, it's I don't know. It's I feel like it's just kind of sad to me, like, that there's people out there that feel that level of desperation, and then they kind of give their power to someone that is not necessarily like trustworthy of that.
Yeah, I feel like that pretty much covers why that happens anywhere in the world, is like a feeling of like disconnection from source, and maybe like just a feeling of like unworthiness there. And I feel like at least in the US, I can say that most Christianity tells you that you are like sinful and you are, separated from God, and that that's a real thing. And that not exclusively, but like that isn't really challenged, that there's this separation aspect and people feel like they're not worthy, that God is up there and they're down here. But I think maybe like just in an extreme circumstance where people feel more psychologically stressed, they could go towards someone who has this like really wild way of trying to like connect you with God, whether it's through them or through some plan that they have to make you connect with God. But yeah, and I was feeling into the situation with like the Kenyan recent like cults going on, and I was also feeling like, I feel like with countries that were where Christianity was imposed kind of like forcefully, there might be this feeling of like Christianity was used as a tool to say like, look at these people, they're heathens, they're ungodly, they are lower than us, they are to be looked down upon and shamed, but we can save their wretched souls with Christianity, like that's how people felt. It wasn't ironic, like I was just being ironic. And so I feel like that's where it comes that's the way that it manifested there. That feeling of like unworthiness and separation, being like, oh, well, we've got all the power, we're the colonizers, God favors us, here's Christianity, adopt this. And then if people agree to that, they're agreeing to that unworthiness. I mean, not to say that them being Christian always results in that, but them accepting the ideology that the colonizing missionaries were presenting to them is they're presenting to them, hey, do you agree in what we feel about you, and will you use Christianity to try to fix that? And obviously it didn't change anything, right? But that's what I felt from it. And so it's just about people knowing that they are worthy of love and that they aren't disconnected from God and they aren't any less than anyone, and they don't have to do anything in particular to prove that they are everyone's equal and that they're divine. You know, I feel like that is the way it manifests there. But correct me if I'm wrong or if there's more info there, but that's what I feel about it. And yeah.
No, I think you're right. I mean, very similar to just like having military factions fighting against each other, you know, like Christianity has been used as a tool of warfare, and it's not like external, like so, you know, dramatic as people using weapons, but you know, it's like a more internal, like psychological tool of like social control, and it's happened across the globe. And I really feel like that is definitely playing out in Kenya and like Mozambique and the other places where we're seeing this cult. And not to say like, you know, being Christian and having Christian traditions is necessarily a bad thing, but I wonder if part of it is also just like forgetting your own culture and like your own, you know, your own essence in a way. And I wonder if that also leads to this feeling of disconnection and sort of like desperation. Because, you know, bringing it back to America, we've seen that happen among indigenous populations where, you know, kids were taken out of the from the tribes, they were taken to these Christian schools and basically whitewashed. And we've, you know, gotten to a point where there's so many indigenous people that don't know their own culture, they don't know their own language, and you know, there's like a feeling of desperation, disconnection. And so I feel like that definitely plays into it, just not allowing people to be themselves, you know, as God created them, because there's variety in life and there's beauty in all these differences that we have. It's you know, it's unifying, but when people come in and try to wash that away, I think this is the consequence, and it's something that can last hundreds of years. It's there until it's reconciled. So I don't know. I wonder if Kenya is like kind of getting to this like reconciliation point among some of the people. I don't know. I don't know if that's resonating with you guys at all.
So I think something that you mentioned that resonates with me quite a bit was that sense that Christianity has been used as an element of warfare. And I almost want to take it almost deflect it a little bit into an element of control. And in that control, it was a control of the relationship with God. So almost monopolizing the relationship with God to the extent that people were taught that they couldn't have a direct relationship with God themselves, which is again part of the sense that there's a disconnect from source. So I think there's definitely a relationship element to it, but it's almost the trauma attached to not forming that relationship. So that almost abandoned, the sense of abandonment, because God would speak to somebody to speak to you, as opposed to having that relationship, kind of makes it feel like a sense of abandonment. And so in that abandonment, there's the traumatic behavior playing out of self-abandonment. And this is why people are so open to being influenced in this negative way, to starve themselves or use insect spray or any other random ritual that is supposedly going to bring them back to God or bring them closer to God. And I think that it's almost the trauma related to having been controlled. As you guys said, that sense of having been colonized, having been controlled, having been enslaved. It's just kind of playing out in a different way, that they're being enslaved to people who are spewing forth crap. So and that's the thing. That kind of still feels to me like almost a need to still heal the trauma related to slavery.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel like that's definitely an area that has not been healed in Africa either. Like I know we've talked a lot about the repercussions of it in the United States, but I think you're absolutely right that it is like a legacy of that time for sure.
I mean, even as you say, the kids being removed from the Native American kids being removed forcefully from their homes. That also that behavior of things being taken away would probably lead to holding on tightly to certain things, whether they're good for you or not.
Yeah.
And inadvertently, they're generally bad for you. But it's almost like, it's literally that picture of, well, give the small teddy bear to God so that you can get the bigger teddy bear. Heal the crap so that you can have the healthier life. Heal the crap so that you can experience peace and joy. It's almost, literally, it might be almost a collective consciousness playing out of the pattern of Stockholm syndrome. You're in love with what the abuse was or the abuser kind of thing, and you don't know how to separate yourself from that relationship trauma. And I think that's why it's probably quite important that we do have these conversations, because we are able to go, well, actually, that's a pattern that's playing out, and potentially there's an opportunity to heal in that space. And I think that's really how this pattern of these charlatans in Africa and cults is being highlighted. It's just, again, what have we learned from the past? And do we really need to repeat the pain in order to learn the lesson? So how does it feel to move on to one of our other topics?
Yeah, that's good.
Good. Awesome. So something that stood out for me also was, and again, it's cycles of learning, right? So the essence of learning. And so the climate, almost the climate control and the of Dominica doing much more in terms of starting to ensure that there are early warning systems, because they're more likely to be affected by climate change because of the fact that they are much more tropical environment. And it seems like they have learned, or they're choosing to learn, the lessons that have presented themselves. And so there's a greater sense of cohesion in terms of the message being shared sooner, and almost filtering into the communities and neighbors starting to engage with each other to say, these are the warnings, be aware, we need to move to higher ground, we need to move to shelters. It's kind of, they've learned the lesson, they've learned from the pain, and they're choosing not to repeat it by actually starting to become a lot more cohesive in caring for each other. And I thought that was quite an interesting opposite view to what these other the past two topics that we just spoke about kind of presented. It just seems like this is a choice not to have to learn through pain again.
Yeah, I feel like it is it's like the empowerment side of what we've been talking about with countries who, how like a lot of countries have been saying, hey, the biggest first world countries that are emitting a lot of carbon, you guys are really screwing us over, and we need you to stop, basically. But that's that's one side of it. Like I mean, I guess identifying the problem and how it's manifesting, but the other side is like determining how you're going to respond, and what you're going to do about it. And Dominica is showing that, which is really great, because they have to do something themselves and not just wait for other countries to do something. Although, yeah, it is helpful to try to contribute to the resolution of like the root issue here, climate change being fueled. And yeah, I think that that's great that they're doing that, because it's like so much more empowering than like not doing that,
Yeah. And I feel like it's just such a great example, because like especially like first world countries like the United States, countries in Europe, that they may look at a country like Dominica and think like, oh, it's a developing nation, they don't have resources, they may not have the innovation, but I thought it was just such a great example that like you don't really need to do anything that crazy. It just involves like a real true intention and a desire to change things. Because like the fact that they're using conch shells as a way to like communicate with each other, that there's some imminent like weather pattern coming, like I just thought that was genius. And I would have never thought to just use something that's already in the environment and so easily accessible. And so I feel like there's so much like fluff around like climate change, and we need all this new technology and all these like crazy things, but I feel like Dominica is like showing the world that there's you can stay really simple but yet be very innovative and produce like a very strong, hopefully like long lasting change, where they're going to just be prepared for floods or hurricanes or whatever's going on. And so I really love the energy of that story. It was very like uplifting and empowering, and it was nice to see, because I feel like developing nations really get like a bad rep. Like even that word like developing, it just like insinuates that you don't really know what you're doing. Like you have no idea how to handle yourself. And so I don't even know if that word is like the best word to use for why do they have to be developing. I feel like America is developing as well in so many ways, but yet, oh, it's the greatest country in the world or whatever. Like there's that attitude, but it's just a facade. And I feel like Dominica is showing like what a facade it is to all these like arbitrary labels that we have about what country is more advanced than the other.
Yeah, I like that you mentioned that as well, because I definitely feel like there's a definite sense of a much greater or a much healthier relationship with nature and with life itself. So, they're looking at the situation and going, okay, we are in a tropical environment. We're probably going to be subject to a lot more climate shifting weather because of the fact that this climate change, the climate change has been happening so much more in less tropical environments. The fact is, it just can't, it's almost that almost conglomeration of everything that happens everywhere else, and it's happening to some of these tropical islands. And they're saying, well, actually, we have a relationship with life and we have a relationship with nature, and we're going to use what's in front of us in order to honor that relationship and to honor life and to honor each other and to respect that we can take care of each other. And I think, you've hit the nail on the head in saying that these arbitrary labels tend to almost give us the sense that some nations are backwards in comparison to others. Whereas we can see very much that in most instances, it's emergence. It's emergence. They learn, they emerge more. They learn, they emerge more. And I think that that's kind of the cycle that feels a lot healthier to me. And it also kind of plays out in how SpaceX has done their incremental learning in trying to launch their rocket ship or launch part of part of the injectors and things like that. It's kind of this sense of incremental learning. So, smaller steps where you can learn faster, as opposed to one massive step where you fail colossally.
And so would you characterize like the most recent thing where that rocket that SpaceX launched, exploded? Was that more of like a big investment for them, or was that more of like a smaller step?
So it's a costly investment for them,
Yeah.
but it is a smaller step. Just the fact that they got that kind of weight actually lifted off the ground for quite a distance tells you that it's almost the sense, and I know it's going to sound ridiculous, but there's the sense of failing forward. So you do things in an agile approach so that you don't wait for a finished product and realize that you've colossally failed. You kind of do minimal viable things so that you can test whether they are actually viable in order to move into the next step. So I hate the term failing forward, but literally it's that sense of failing in smaller components so that you can learn lessons at a faster pace. So for SpaceX, it was probably a very expensive exercise, but I still believe that it's a much more agile approach to learning.
So yeah, I see what you mean, and I agree. I felt that it fit well into that topic that we have of like learning, because I'm like, this rocket exploding, like it's part of learning, and the company has shown itself to be like not afraid of failure, and trying new things. And Elon Musk also definitely has shown himself to be that. And he is very controversial now, and mainly for his like whole buyout and takeover of Twitter. And people are debating whether or not what he's been doing with Twitter is good, But, he has made some interesting points about like free speech and allowing people to say what they're going to say, because they're going to say it anyway, somewhere. But I've been thinking about that. But I feel like the thing where the media, a lot of the media really, an area where they really fall short, or I guess like contribute to separation consciousness, is how they seem to like jump in on the bandwagon of let's like all like point and laugh at Elon Musk, like, haha, your rocket exploded, you can't do anything right. Like, I feel like the whole liberal media machine, and it's funny to say that because I wouldn't have said that before. That's like a phrase that people of very different political persuasions use, okay? But the whole liberal media machine is is trying to make Elon Musk look like some fool because his expensive rocket exploded. And when I'm looking at it without removing any bias or ill feelings toward him, which I've been doing so in myself, I'm like, this is just part of learning, but the media is jumping in. It knows many people. Many people would love to ridicule Elon Musk, right? And be like, oh, what a failure you are. But the reality of it is it's just learning. So I just wanted to point that out. You're not going to hear this from the mainstream media.
Only here.
I think it's very interesting that you mentioned it, because one of the things, I mean, can you imagine that they waited until they had what they believed was the most viable product, went to launch with people inside the thing, and then it exploded? It would be even more vilified. So it kind of makes sense to me for things of this scale to fail in that way. They fail in smaller components so that they also understand the risk factors attached to attempting those type of launches. And I mean, like when you read the article, there's a significant approval process that they've gone through with NASA in order to even just have the ability to launch it. And that for me is also saying, it's kind of, how viable is it to have significant disaster, or how viable is it to have smaller disasters that don't impact human life, so that you learn to ensure that you are ensuring the safety of human life and honoring life when you do go for the big launch, when you do say, okay, this is the one that's going into space now. And then, he's got a big, hairy, audacious goal. He wants to help colonize Mars. Like, come on. Let's also respect that innovation sometimes takes a really big goal, and people are going to ridicule you. People ridiculed Henry Ford for the first production line. And then that became the way we did business for the longest time, until automation started coming in, until innovation changed the Ford model of production. There's always going to be ridicule. And, I remember very much from school that my teachers also always said that the ridicule generally comes from the small minds.
Yeah, haters are gonna hate.
Thanks, Taylor.
Like, no matter what you feel about Elon Musk, like, that man is doing things. Like, you can't deny he is going out and he's trying things, and he's not afraid to just do it. And so, like, from that aspect, you got to respect him, in my opinion. I don't know.
Yeah.
I was just going to say the same thing, is that, from both of these stories, we kind of get, like, at least they're doing it. There's something that means something to them, and they're doing it. They're taking the steps forward and actually doing something about it. And that, I think that definitely there's something to be said for that. And especially with like when it comes to climate change, and because it seems like everyone is just sitting on their hands about this huge issue. And it's like, why just do something, anything, for the love of God, something that will help us here. And Dominica, we're seeing, is doing something, and I think that's really encouraging. And I just love, I'm glad to see it. It's pretty cool to see.
Yeah,
I agree with you. I completely agree with you. And I think one of the things that also stood out in the other article that Sage shared was that 2023 would be the first time where greenhouse gas emissions are reducing. And I think it was you that shared it, right, Sage?
Yeah, I did share it.
So yeah, and you know, and I think it's again, like if you read that article, it speaks to tipping points in history, tipping points in cycles. So there's always a significant struggle to get something adopted, but there comes a point where the old way is actually very inefficient, and there is a desire to shift into something new. And it's literally with us as well, with human beings. You get bored of a certain way after a certain period of time, and something has to change. Well, I'm gonna use this term very loosely. If you're a normal functioning person, you're probably looking for cyclical movement. There probably are people that are very comfortable to not have that shift, that are very comfortable in their comfort zone. But that also tells you that history wouldn't have been made if there were not pioneers and early adopters, and that tipping point that went from, it's not so efficient and safe to travel by horseback anymore. So let's go and invest in a car, you know, and that tipping point that happens even with renewable energy and renewable electricity from a climate change point of view, that says actually at some point it becomes cheaper to invest in solar and wind power than to use fuel, coal and gas. And so the tipping point will always be there, and we kind of need to be open to the shift. And we also need to be very conscious of not listening to the naysayers too much. Because again, you know, SpaceX is pioneering their own spaceship, where before, from history, there were very few that were even delved into that kind of technology, and also the expense at which that kind of technology needs to be developed, you know, all of those things. But it shifts. It just takes one person to be brave enough to prove that it's possible, so that that shift comes about. And I think it's again related to part of that YouTube video that Adam shared, in terms of how those cycles of movement happen, and what those shifts mean for humanity.
Yeah, and I love what you said about how it became inefficient to travel by horseback, and then cars were introduced because it's just funny. Yeah. It'd be funny to imagine if, like, in the past, like the US or other governments were influenced by the big horse lobby, like they're influenced by big oil nowadays. Like, oh, it's big horse, they're holding back on the automobile industry. I just felt that was funny. But yeah, so just to clarify with the article, the 2023 is set to be the first year where in the energy sector, greenhouse gas emissions are reducing, which is like a huge deal, because the energy sector is a massive contributor to emissions, you know. And there are other sectors too that are huge, like transportation and manufacturing, particularly the concrete industry, apparently. But there are some concrete improvements that could be made in it. The technology already exists. But so anyway, my point is that, like, before, demand for energy is rising as the population rises constantly. In the past, like renewable energy production has risen with demand, just about with demand, but it has never exceeded the amount in which demand rose. But recently it has been the adoption of renewable energy. It's been the rate of the adoption of renewable energy has been exceeding the increases, right, in demand for power. So that's what it is. And yeah, I guess it is largely because the technologies become cheaper and better understood and implemented and more efficient in all the ways that it needs to be. And yeah, so it's a great sign. And yeah.
So there's learning happening there. That's one. That's a positive.
Yes, there's learning happening there. And I think it's a good thing. And maybe a lot of it driving it is just dollars and cents. But I feel like that's okay, partly because we're always meant to grow in our efficiency and our ability to use resources. And we're always meant to grow in our abundance on Earth. So it's not a bad thing that environmentally conscious things would succeed when they become really economically viable, because like it's not divine to feel like we have to trade prosperity for climate sustainability.
Yeah.
You know, and so I think that's great and that's natural and it makes sense, you know. So yay. Yeah. It makes me, I wonder if Greta Thunberg said anything about it, because she always usually comments on big climate news.
Probably.
I don't know. Anyway, that's how I felt about it.
Yeah, and I like that you've raised that, because it does feel like a positive shift. It feels like a positive way of learning. The SpaceX example, the sense of tipping points in the learning cycle. So as we learn to learn, and we learn to learn more efficiently. And so it's literally the sense of cyclical growth through learning, through making mistakes, which we have identified as is potentially safe to make mistakes because they are lessons. You know, and I think that is something that we've probably had to also recondition from a human being point of view, that mistakes were always seen to be a bad thing, and mistakes were almost punishable. And so it is something that, you know, it's a piece of healing to be done, but also a piece of unlearning. We need to unlearn that it's not safe to learn. And I think that's something that's probably quite important for humanity, is that we need to learn that it's safe to learn again, so that we continue to grow and develop and literally come into greater fullness.
Yep.
Awesome, guys. So yeah, we've reached our hour. Any last comments?
I feel complete.
Awesome. So thank you, everybody, for following us. Thank you to the team for the conversation. To everybody that has followed us, please also feel free to like and subscribe to our Church of Union YouTube channel, where you'll find all our previous conversations. And we look forward to seeing you all again next week for another conversation in our world today, the Unionist perspective. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.